Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I thought I would start by just giving a little bit of background and context to my job at the Star, and I think how it kind of fits in with what you're all discussing today. So I've been the working wealth reporter at the Star for about 4 years now, and a lot of people ask me what that job title actually means. And really the idea behind creating this beat was to sort of update the labor beat as we used to know it, which was very focused on kind of union politics, to talk more broadly about the way that work interacts with our lives, and in particular, we hope, sort of bring visibility to folks who may not even have union protection, or whose voices are perhaps otherwise ignored even in the sort of traditional labor context. So that's the direction that I've really tried to take the beat in, and for a little bit more background, the Toronto Star was founded in 1892, and it was actually founded by a group of pressmen who were on strike from what is now the Globe and Mail, and they really wanted to create a paper where workers' rights was central to the kind of identity of the publication. And so there's a sort of long tradition of trying to put workers at the center of our reporting. So it's really been a privilege to be able to explore some of these issues with the backing of the Star. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about one of the stories that I think we really tried to use it as a platform to bring visibility to new Canadians in the workforce and the challenges that they often face in the labor market. In the first couple years on my beat, I'd spoken sort of anecdotally to a lot of temp agency workers about their experiences on the job, and the refrain that I kept hearing over and over again was that when they'd show up at a workplace, they'd be working alongside permanent employees, and the most dangerous jobs would be given to them because, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why, but the biggest reason was that if they got injured on the job, that injury wouldn't turn up on the client company's record at the WSIB. And most of these workers were new Canadians, or faced other barriers to getting a stable job, and we're looking for work in a context where there are fewer and fewer stable jobs. So really a population that was quite squeezed. And then around that time, there was some investigative reporting done in the United States that showed that temp agency workers were actually twice as likely to get injured on the job as permanent employees. And I was really interested in trying to find out whether there was data to match up in Canada with this anecdotal stuff that I'd been hearing from temp agency workers. And the first thing I found was that it was actually really difficult to find that data. And to me, that just spoke to the reality that this workforce of temporary employees is not just invisible often to the broader public, but it's also missing in our accounting of what is happening in the workplace officially, in our collection of statistics. So I had to find a new way into the story. So what I did was start to read through hundreds of court bulletins that the Ministry of Labour issues every time they prosecute an employer for a workplace accident. And in those bulletins, it would note whether the worker was hired through a temp agency. So I isolated all of those cases. And I came across this company called Fiera Foods that was prosecuted in, I believe, 2011. And Fiera Foods is an industrial bakery in North York. They're a major employer in the region. They make croissants and pastries for a lot of major brands, Tim Hortons, Metro, Walmart, Costco. So all of us have probably eaten their products, and we've all probably seen the factory as you're driving down the 401 where it meets the 400. You can see their big facility there. So if you've read the story, you'll know a little bit about some of the accidents that occurred there, but a piece of the story that didn't make it into the investigation that really was the kind of kernel that grabbed my attention was this. There was this 69-year-old security guard who was hired through a temp agency named Aydin Kazimov. The ministry later convicted Ramora, which was the adjacent facility, in not taking appropriate precautions to keep him safe on the job. But the backstory is that he was patrolling, I guess, the perimeter of the factory without any kind of visibility gear. The lighting was very poor. There was no guardrails in his little security area. And a worker who was leaving the factory after a 10-hour shift and didn't see him hit him in his car. And he kind of panicked and drove off, and then realized what he'd done, and within 60 seconds turned around and came back to help the man. But at that point, it was too late. A transport truck had left the facility and crushed the security guard. So as a result, the worker who initially hit him lost his license. He had his license taken away. And so he was unable to get to work. He was at home, relying on his partner's income. And he was at home with his baby daughter who had an asthma attack. And because he couldn't drive, he couldn't take her to hospital. The ambulance didn't come in time, and the little girl died. And this backstory to me really highlighted this really devastating ripple effect that an industrial accident can have, not just on the victim's family, but all these other kind of unintended consequences that are sort of doubly invisible. We don't even hear that much about the victims of industrial accidents, let alone their colleagues or other people who may have been impacted by it. The more I dug into this facility, I found that it had been slapped with hundreds of orders for health and safety violations. I started to hear from workers who had worked there who said it was heavily reliant on temp agency workers, that it was mostly new Canadians. And as I was kind of researching, another temp agency worker died in the factory, and that was when we decided that there was really a compelling public interest to go undercover and find out exactly what was happening inside this factory. And part of the reason beyond the public interest element was that when you take a decision like that as a newspaper, you have to think first, is there a public interest, but also is there any other way that you can tell this story, because really this has to be a last resort. And we just felt that because of the real precarity of this workforce, the task of asking someone who is making minimum wage, is hired through a temp agency and can be dismissed at a moment's notice, who's a new Canadian and faces all these other barriers to setting up a life in Canada, asking them to come forward and put their name in the paper and take on this really powerful employer is very daunting. So that's what kind of drove the decision to go undercover. So I turned up at the factory. There was a sign right outside that directed workers inside if they had temporary employment inquiries, so really no bones made about what kind of job opportunities were on offer there. I was given a number for a temp agency, and 2 weeks later they called me up and told me to show up the next day for a shift. I got about 5 minutes safety training. I was basically shown a piece of paper with some drawings of a machine and told not to put my hand in the machine, and sent on my way. And really just looking at who was in that factory and who was working through temp agencies and who was doing this kind of labor was really illuminating. It was almost without exception people of color and new Canadians. And from the perspective of the factory and the temp agencies, what they were doing was providing flexibility to these workers, is how they phrased it. Flexibility that allowed the workers to balance their personal life with work at the factory. But when you kind of dug down and spoke to workers about their experience, it seemed pretty clear that the flexibility only went in one direction, and the power dynamic was one where, you know, a worker was not empowered to speak out if they saw something that was not safe. They weren't even given the tools to identify what was not safe. If they were sick, they had to either, you know, miss a day's pay and risk not being asked back to the factory, or come in sick and be handling food. And the pathway to a permanent job, which is often how temp agencies are sold, seemed sort of non-existent. I mean, I spoke to some people who'd been there for years, working through a temp agency, and still weren't permanent. In addition to that, we were paid in cash, and we picked up our salary from a payday lender with no pay stubs and no deductions. And I actually had one colleague who went to go pick up her pay at this payday lender, and because we worked long hours, it was difficult to sort of go regularly, so she hadn't been for several weeks and was picking up hundreds of dollars worth of money, and immediately after she was robbed, and she lost all that money that she'd earned. So all these kind of safety issues that aren't just confined to the workplace, they actually kind of spill over into other elements of the worker's life. And the third thing that we ended up finding by going undercover was that not only was there this sort of bizarre kind of payment setup, but the temp agency itself didn't have a physical office. So when we turned up to the office that was listed on their corporate records, it was an empty unit in a strip mall. So you can imagine if you're a worker and something goes wrong, or you're not sure you got paid right, or you're worried about picking up your pay at a payday lender, you're stuck between a factory who says you're not technically our employee, a temp agency that doesn't have an office, and you can't just knock on their door and ask for help, and a payday lender who obviously has no legal obligation to you whatsoever. And you know, when I asked them, where's my pay stub, they just sort of said, it's not our problem, we just hand out the cash. So workers are really squeezed in what's been called this triangular relationship, and what we actually found there was sort of more than a triangular relationship. There were all these different actors involved in the worker's life. The last thing I sort of want to touch on is the young woman who had died in the factory shortly before I went undercover. Her name was Amina Diaby. She was 23 years old, and she had come to Canada fleeing a forced marriage in Guinea, and met her husband here and got married, and she wanted to go to nursing school, so she picked up this job at Fiera to help save money. And she died after 2 weeks on the job when her headscarf got caught in a machine and strangled her. We really felt strongly that, with the blessing of her family, if they felt comfortable with it, that she deserved to have a name and a face, and to not just be this sort of anonymous victim that no one ever thinks about twice, and to paint this picture of someone who had a full life and a rich life, and whose death, could have been prevented had there been proper safety procedures at that facility. But the challenge in doing that is actually, as a journalist, finding out the details of what happened and who this family is. And this information in Canada is not public information. In the United States, at least until Trump, this type of stuff was all public information. There was a fatality reports that you could find out what happened, who the worker was, who the employer was, all that kind of thing. So we found Amina's family really after a year of searching and just cold calling community groups and reaching out to people who had worked at the factory, and eventually through a really long process were connected to her husband. And so when I met her husband, it was almost exactly a year since she died, and he still really had not a lot of information about what happened to her, and to me it really just portrayed the way that new Canadians often fall through the cracks. And it's not to cast aspersion on the folks who are, tasked with dealing bureaucratically with the fallout of a tragedy like this, but he had met with the WSIB and the Ministry of Labour in the wake of the accident, but as someone who doesn't speak English very well and is in the midst of this overwhelming crisis, I think he really didn't absorb a lot of those conversations. And when he started getting letters from the WSIB, he didn't know what to do with them. He hadn't heard for months from the Ministry of Labour, and he didn't know why. So it just pointed to the extra work that needs to be done when the families are already vulnerable or face other barriers to dealing with the bureaucracy of what happens in the wake of these tragedies. Eventually the company was fined $300,000. They were found guilty in Amina Diaby's death, and I will just conclude on a happy note to say that more importantly, there's been a number of legislative changes since then that have really changed the landscape, I think, for temp agency workers, including joint liability at the compensation board for injuries, for temp workers' injuries. So I think that really goes a long way to addressing the structural reasons why temp agency workers often feel invisible and feel like they're unable to advocate for themselves in the workplace. I'll take any questions now, or wait till the end.
Two mics.
Does anybody have any questions for Sarah right now? No? There's mics if you could walk to the mic. I don't know if you can pick it up.
I'm curious if you, on follow-up after Amina's death, if you had heard of any actions that Fiera Foods had taken to mediate some of those risks, or corrective actions that they had taken to improve their record.
Yeah. So their, I guess, official line through the whole thing was that they do take health and safety seriously, and that they'd reviewed all their policies in the wake of her death. After the initial investigation, we actually filed some more Freedom of Information requests to the compensation board to try and understand really what was happening behind the scenes. And what was interesting was that after she died, the factory did in fact reach out to the compensation board and asked to participate in their Work Well program, which is meant to try and improve voluntary compliance. We sort of read through all these emails, internal emails back and forth, and the Work Well guy shows up to Fiera Foods and he writes back to his superiors and says, I don't think these people are genuine. So I think it's tough. I think it's tough to tell when it's sort of performative versus when there's a real desire to change culture around health and safety, because I think it is a culture. It's not just signing up for piecemeal things here and there and trying to improve the optics. So I haven't been back inside the factory since then, so I can't say whether they've totally upturned the way they do things, but my understanding is that model of relying on temp agency workers has not changed, and I think that that's a red flag if your business model is dependent on this extremely vulnerable workforce that is made even more vulnerable by the very structure of their employment. I guess I would question whether that's genuine transformation.